Hey guys. Happy Tuesday. Yeah, fortunately. Just at the top, and then I'll take your questions. Did want to speak briefly about the terrorist attack earlier today in Istanbul. The United States strongly condemns the terrorist attack took place earlier today in Fatih neighborhood of Istanbul, Turkey. We extend our deepest condolences to the families of those killed, and we wish a quick and full recovery to those injured. The United States reaffirms our strong commitment to work with Turkey, a NATO ally, and a valued member of the counter-ISIL or counter-Daesh coalition to combat the shared threat of terrorism. Matt, over to you.
Oh, that's it?
That's it.
Nothing else? No grand announcements?
No.
Before we get into policy substance, I want to just do a couple little housekeeping things.
Yes, sir.
One, is there anything new on the look into or the response to Congressman Chaffetz on the briefing video edit?
No, all I would just say, by way of update, is that we're discussing the letter with the committee and his request, the request in the letter for Secretary Kerry to testify, and we're discussing it with the committee as we would any request, but I don't have any additional details or updates to provide.
Well, actually, that's not the letter I'm talking. I'm referring to the
sorry.
one where he asked for the documents.
Okay.
Thank you for the answer on the
I've
other.
already, that's right. But we are also planning to respond to that letter, the initial letter, tomorrow. They did request a pretty extensive amount of information, so we're going to provide what we can tomorrow, and we'll continue to try to provide additional information.
Do you know what that will include?
I don't, and I'll try to get a better grasp of what precisely we're going to be able to answer tomorrow. I think we're trying to simply manage. This is I think it's one of 10 outstanding requests that we have from the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee on a broad range of topics. So we're just trying to obviously be responsive, but with the understanding that we've got a lot of requests from that committee.
Right, okay, well, I mean, has this bounced to the front of the line? Or in terms of what you're responding to?
Well, that's a fair question. I think we're trying to be responsive to the deadline for tomorrow, so we're trying to answer what we can by tomorrow.
And then on the request for the secretary to appear and testify, I mean, is it the department's position that this is a legitimate valid request or legitimate valid use of the secretary's time to go up and testify, or do you?
Well, I think we're still having that conversation with through our office, congressional liaison office, with the committee directly, looking at a number of factors, including his availability, as well as other issues.
So do those
no decision's been made yet.
Do those other, right? Well, could you just give us an idea of what the other issues are?
Just again,
does the
whether he's the
department believe that
appropriate,
he is the
right?
right-
Whether he's the
right.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you're about to answer it.
Yes, that's okay.
Is he the appropriate person?
Well, that's one thing we're looking at, whether he'd be the best person to answer the questions that they have and to speak to the issue. And then again, he's as many of you know, he's going to be on the road again next week, so
Right.
he's
Okay.
not often in Washington.
Yes, you can say that again.
Where's he going next week?
We'll announce when we're ready to announce.
I thought you were about to say something.
No.
And then on the second
Sure.
issue, which is actually two issues, on the email, former Secretary Clinton's email, these two filings that were made, one in the TPP one about, I understand that this is a rather large request involving large amounts, but of email that would have to be gone through and looked at. But is it really the case that it would take until almost December to?
Yeah. I mean, look, and you're right to say we don't comment on ongoing FOIA requests, but maybe to give you a little bit of context, and because there's in the actual article that referred to this request, there are some additional details which allows me to give a little bit more context. But based on the information in the original article about this FOIA request, this is a very broad request. I think it asks for any correspondence sent over a 4-year period between sort of 2009 to 2013 between the staff of the Office of the Secretary and the staff in the USTR, U.S. Trade Representative's Office, that mentions TPP. So that's going to be a broad spectrum of emails. And so it's not just related to Secretary Clinton's emails. So given the scope of that, we're trying to, and the fact, frankly, that we've got, as many of you are tired of hearing me say, but we've got, we received approximately 22,000 FOIA requests in the last fiscal year. There's a lot to go through. So it's not simply an estimate that we're throwing out a date like that. It's based on our best estimation right now.
Right, but do you have any idea of what the universe is of emails that you would have to go through to, I mean, is it like every single email that was sent between here and USTR that would have to be looked at?
I mean, that is the,
But
again,
is-
that's
but
the
that is a
parameters.
smaller
It's-
universe
It is.
than
but
every single email
Of
that
course.
everyone sent.
But it is, but it's over a 4-year period, and it's
Right.
between, and
Okay.
it's on a very hot button issue at the time.
And the date given, I mean, does November 31st exist as a date in the State Department calendar? Or is, or what's the deal with that? I mean, is that one of these weird alter universe kind of things?
No, look, I assume whoever gave that date meant to say the last day of November. And again, excuse me, again, just with the understanding that, as you guys know from the FOIA request we did with Secretary Clinton's emails, is, these dates are subject to change as we work on them and process them. If we need more time, we'll let
So-
folks know.
So, in fact, the correct date should have been the 30th of November?
That's right.
All right, and then the last one on this,
Yep.
and the other one, the RNC FOIA request, that you guys say it's gonna take 75 years to complete?
And I actually did a little digging on this, and that is an incredible number. So I can't comment specifically because it's a matter of ongoing litigation, but I would ask you guys to look at the court filings that do provide the details on why we arrived at that figure. I mean, it's an enormous amount of emails, or rather, it's an enormous amount of FOIA requests, and very broad and very complex. So.
Well, yeah, this stuff would be released sooner than 75 years, just under the regular record, wouldn't it? I mean,
Again,
Foreign relations
it
of the United
is-
States, the volume, I mean, that's longer than most classifications last until. I mean, a
Well-
lot of the stuff that's classified is for only 20 years. 75 years seems,
Again, I would refer you to the court filing. It's a very broad range involving a number of people over a period of, I think, 4 years. And it's not an outlandish estimation, believe it or not.
it's not outlandish. I mean, it just, I mean,
Just-
if
I
stuff is
refer you
coming.
to I refer you to the court filing. It gives the rationale behind this estimate.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
Sure.
I want to get onto this story of the UN removing Saudi Arabia from the Saudi Arabia-led coalition fighting in Yemen from a child rights blacklist. The UN report actually said that children, and it was a report on children and armed conflict. It was released last Thursday. It said the coalition was responsible for 60% of child deaths and injuries in Yemen last year. Yet they've now removed the Saudi-led coalition from that blacklist after a lot of pressure, cajoling, and all kinds of things. And first of all, do you have a comment on this specific development? And number two, has the U.S. Raised this issue with the UN or the Saudis?
So first of all, just a comment on the report and the latest development that the UN will conduct a further review of the information. We obviously note this latest development, and we have urged the kingdom's expeditious and transparent participation in the review process. We take very seriously the protection of children in armed conflict in Yemen and frankly anywhere in the world, and continue to urge all sides in the conflict in Yemen to protect civilians and comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. And that includes the obligation to distinguish between military and civilian targets, and to take all feasible steps to minimize harm to civilian. We have regularly engaged with Saudi officials, as well as other coalition members, on the importance of mitigating attacks on civilians or injuries to civilians, and the need to investigate all credible reports of civilian casualties. And just what you said, but you also asked whether we played a role. I mean, we have repeatedly called on all parties to the conflict to protect civilians and to uphold their obligations, as I said. And Saudi Arabia has pledged to establish a commission to investigate credible reports of civilian casualties and deaths resulting from Saudi-led airstrikes, Saudi-led coalition airstrikes, rather. And they've promised a clear and full and objective report on their findings. And we're encouraging them to move forward with that as quickly as possible.
So when you said you spoke, no. Did
I
you,
apologize.
Did you talk to the UN about this report after its publication?
We did not. I don't believe we spoke directly to the UN about this report, no.
Would you not think that the UN, that a UN report, a UN investigation, is an independent report in itself? I mean, why would the Saudis? It's like investigating my own murder in some ways.
Well, again, I'd refer to the UN to explain the rationale behind their decision now to look again or conduct a further review of this report. All I can say is that, or all I would point you to is that the fact that Saudi Arabia has said that they would also look into these, that they would establish an investigatory body. We're going to obviously encourage them to do so, and to do so in an expeditious manner. They have said that they are concerned by these civilian reports of civilian casualties, and they will look into it.
Could I follow up?
Yeah, sure.
Because the ambassador of Saudi Arabia
Yep.
basically said that that'll never happen again. I mean, that was his suggestion today or yesterday.
That what would never happen?
In response to a possible review by the UN, that the UN may revisit this issue again. You have any comment on that?
I apologize. I want to make sure I understand what his comments were. That
His comments were that it was wrong to begin with, and that the UN will not do the same thing again. That's
In
what he
other
said.
words, that the removal
From
of Saudi from the
removal,
list is
yeah.
irrevocable, and no matter
Right.
what happens in any
Yes.
follow-up and
Thank you.
subsequent investigation, probe, review,
Right.
whatever, they won't be put back on, even if it finds that they should be.
again, I'm going to let the process play itself out. I think that's where we are. The UN said they're going to look again at the findings of this. Saudis said they're going to cooperate with them in this effort. Let's see what comes of that
The
process.
United States welcomed the decision to look again.
I think we respect the UN's decision on this.
Well, we would expect, though, that if this review that's going to take place was to determine what was found initially, that it would be restored, right? That the findings
Precisely.
would be restored.
Let's let the process play itself out. They have said they're going to look again at the findings, review the information in the
Right.
report,
But
and
if
they'll
that-
reach a
and I-
conclusion.
I
We'll respect.
I realize that
Yep.
this is a hypothetical question.
Yes, it is.
But presumably, if there was to be this review, and if it were to come up with the same finding that it had initially found, the United States would believe that the Saudis should be put back on this list, right?
Again, there's going to be, I'll just leave it where I left it, which
So
is
in other
there's going to
words,
be a
if the
joint,
fo-
there's going to be a joint review of
Yeah, I
the
got
report's
it. And if
findings.
that joint review finds the same thing that they had initially been determined, you would think, I mean, it would be logical to assume.
It would be
that
logical
the
for
United
us to.
States government.
It would be logical for you to assume that. Let's let the process play itself out.
Well, you're not saying that if it finds the same thing that it found the first time, that that it should stay the same, they should be left off the list, are you?
No,
Oh,
no.
Was it odd to have it added on, suddenly on Friday, then taken out on Monday? Do you find
Again, I
that
can't
odd?
speak
Because
to
it was
I
not
can't speak to
on
the internal
list.
processes of the UN. I would have to refer you to them on why they made the decision.
To reopen it, do you think there was some weakness in the report as it was?
Again, I can't speak on behalf of the UN. All I can say is
No,
that
I'm
in
asking
their
you, does the
estimation,
United
no, but in
States
their
believe there was some
estimation,
weakness in the
well, I
report?
think in their estimation, they acknowledge that they want to review the findings of it. I'll take that for what it's worth.
But the UN has done that before. Israel was on that list, it was taken out. They never really revisited the issue. I mean, if you want to look at precedent, the UN record is not quite good, is it?
Again, let's let the process.
I know we're going to do the process, but I just want to come back to on the record that the U.S. Just want to make sure that the U.S. did not participate in putting pressure on the UN to remove Saudi Arabia from the list until the next review had been done.
Again, no, I'm not aware that we had put any pressure on the UN. I mean,
Well,
beyond
the
what
Saudis
I
are
have
an
said is that
ally.
we take these reports very seriously of civilian casualties, and all credible reports, as we've said many, many times, need to be investigated, and Saudis have pledged to do so.
Have the Saudis asked the U.S. to lobby on their behalf before the UN on this matter?
I'm not aware of that, and I don't know that I would even acknowledge that if that was the case.
Would the U.S. would that even be an appropriate request from a country with whom the U.S. has close relations?
Look, Raz, I think what's important here is that if there were concerns within the UN itself about the credibility of this report, or even the integrity of this report, that it be the strongest possible report possible, that they should look again at it, and they have pledged to do so jointly with the Saudis. As to what role we would possibly play in that, we have said that we support investigations into allegations of civilian casualties.
well, what's really important here is that civilians, including children, not
Precisely.
be killed,
Thank you.
and not the integrity
you.
of a report.
I would agree.
So,
I would agree.
That would be more important, right?
I would agree. And as we've said, that all sides in this conflict take every possible precaution to avoid civilian casualties.
This is just slightly related,
Yes.
and I don't know, I can't honestly remember. Has the U.S. ratified, is the U.S. a state, a party to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child?
You know what? I will take that question. I don't know off the top of my head. Sure.
Have you had a chance to review the speech made by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad before the People's Council? And do you have any comments on that? I mean, he basically.
It's a wide open question. So.
Okay, let me.
No, it's okay.
Let me narrow it down.
I mean,
Because
no,
he said
that's okay.
that he is intent on liberating every inch of Syria, which means that this war will go on until what he called all terrorists are rooted out.
I mean, okay. First of all, it was vintage Assad. There were no surprises in what he said, unfortunately. Would all of us like to see him get up and say that, that recognizes his role in the carnage in Syria and to pledge to step aside and for that a political transition could take place? Sure. But I think I said, would we have all liked that? But he did not. I said this was vintage Assad. He basically got up and said what he always says, which is that he's going to never back down, never step aside, going to keep up the fight, and never recognize the role that he has directly played in creating the conditions that exist today in Syria, where Daesh has been able to get a strong foothold and establish itself, where you've got segments of the population cut off from humanitarian assistance deliberately by the regime. This is a reality that he has single-handedly created.
I could never understand what.
To recapture the entire country, do you regard Syrian government forces as being party to the cessation of hostilities?
I think that, well, look, I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric, obviously. I think we spoke yesterday about the authority that the Syrian regime has to go after Nusra and Daesh, and that we respect that authority for them to do so, as long as they don't go after
You said
parties
every
to
inch of Syrian territory. That includes areas that are held by groups that are party to the cessation. He's declared an intent to attack them. Should they refrain from counterattacking?
Again, it's typical of his rhetoric. I think that,
His prior actions.
and his prior actions, legitimate question or legitimate point. I think what we're going to look going forward, though, is the fact that we still believe that Russia, that Iran, can at least appeal to those in the regime who still have influence on him to refrain from letting this political process, this cessation of hostilities, fall completely apart. But it is. Again, there's nothing surprising in what he said today, but it was discouraging.
Maybe you just go back to a point that he said. He accused Erdogan
Yeah.
of sending lately. He used the word in Arabic, which means lately, connoting like a recent time, of thousands of fighters into Aleppo. Do you agree? Do you have any information that thousands of foreign fighters have crossed into the Aleppo area in recent weeks or months?
No, I mean, I don't know. These are not new accusations or allegations thrown by the Syrian regime at Turkey or at Turkish leadership, I guess. Again, Aleppo is a very dynamic, very difficult place in terms of trying to, delineate the good from the bad, and we recognize that, but we've seen no effort by Turkey to.
So you reject the accusation that Turkey sent in thousands of fighters into Syria, at least in recent times?
Yes.
Hey, Mark, you
Please.
said that you still hope that, or you still believe that Russia and Iran can appeal to those who have influence with Assad. Does that mean that you no longer believe that they have influence with Assad himself? And are we seeing what we were seeing back in the early days of this conflict, where there was an active attempt by the U.S. and by the Europeans to split the government, to isolate Assad within his own regime?
I was simply react. Sorry, I don't mean to finish.
Or do you still think the Russians and the Iranians have influence with Assad himself?
We are hopeful that they do. I mean, because much of this hinges on that.
But it doesn't look like it, given the speech that you gave.
That's
today,
why
correct?
which is why I
Right.
couched my response in
And
that
then-
way.
And then you said, well, we'd all like to see him get up and say to his parliament or to whoever, yeah, this is all my fault and I'm going to leave. But you don't
No.
honestly think that he's
No.
ever going to do that.
That's yeah.
Does the U.S. take
I-
Assad's assertion?
Yes, I was
Does the U.S.
being
take,
somewhat facetious.
Yeah. Does the U.S. government take seriously Assad's assertion that this new parliament, to which he was speaking today, is a legitimate government, and thereby implying that his own leadership is legitimate?
No, I mean, thanks for bringing that up, Roz. I mean, we said at the time that calling for and holding parliamentary elections under the conditions such as they existed at the time and continue to exist, which the regime continues to carry out attacks on civilians that it purports to represent, rings especially hollow. So, and the fact that more than half of the country's citizens are displaced either within the borders of the country or outside the borders of the country, it calls into question the integrity of any kind of election.
So no commendation for electing a woman Speaker of the House.
I'll let that stand.
Can I change that?
Please, go ahead. Are we done with Syria?
On Syria?
Yeah, let's finish with Syria, sure.
It seems the regime backed with the Russians are advancing into the province of Al-Raqqa. Will you consider positive if they liberate Al-Raqqa from ISIL?
Well, so we're not, I'm not able to speak on behalf of what the Syrian military offensive may look like, where it may be in terms of advancing on Raqqa. I can't really confirm those reports. All I can say is that we, the Counter ISIL Coalition, are supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces in taking the fight against, or to rather, ISIL, trying to retake land, trying to hit their transportation links, communications, supply routes into Raqqa to weaken its grip on the city. And those efforts continue, and we recognize it's going to be a long process.
But you just said that you recognize that Assad regime have authority to fight ISIL and
I said but I can't confirm the reports that they're.
No, I'm not asking about confirming. I said if they liberate it, will you welcome that?
I'll say what I've said before when they liberated Palmyra, which is, it's I guess relatively better than ISIL, but not much.
Can we go to a roll?
Please. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's okay.
sure.
Let's finish up.
Do you have any response to the statement put out today by the Washington Post editorial board, which was very critical of the administration's policy on humanitarian assistance in Syria, specifically of the secretary himself?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, speaking about humanitarian assistance and the difficulties that we're still having, and by we, I mean the international community and the UN in getting that assistance to these besieged areas. We've said it before, it's unacceptable. The international community has pressed the regime to provide access, unimpeded access to all of these besieged areas. And these are areas that have been determined to be besieged by the UN, not by the regime. And that's really the only acceptable standard. I would just say that we expect the regime to approve the UN's request for access, either by air or by land. And we've said before, land is the preferred method. And we're going to keep pressuring them to adhere to the UN's demands. More broadly, recognizing fully that we're not where we need to be in terms of humanitarian assistance and access, we can point to the fact that since the cessation of hostilities came into effect, I think something like 700,000 Syrians have received aid, and many, but not all, besieged areas have been reached. Again, it's not perfect by any means, and I'm not going to claim that it is, but it's better than it was. But we need to keep the pressure on them. And also, just the idea that this is somehow the U.S., we all agreed on this in Vienna. Russia, Iran, all the members of the ISSG who were in that room agreed that that complete and utter and full access to the besieged areas needed to be provided. This isn't some U.S. wish list. This is all of the members of the ISSG and the UN agreed on this. So we need to continue to pressure and look at options, and the World Food Program is doing so. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to clarify, or see if I can get clarified your
sure.
use of the word expect, which often has several meanings. When you say you expect the regime to approve the request, why? In what sense do you expect them to? You think that they should, or you have some indication that leads you to believe that they are going to? Because as far as I can tell, they've said no to everything, and for quite some, for quite some time to the besieged areas that were mentioned in Vienna in particular.
Sure. I'll go with the first definition. The World Food Program is in communications with the regime regarding airdrop logistics, because the regime has up till now not provided overland access. I know they're looking. I think they're looking at 4 specific communities. Daraya is one of them. And yes, we're going to keep pressuring them to provide access. I can't say that they're going to agree or not, but we're going to keep the pressure on them. And we expect Russia and Iran especially to put pressure on them.
Yeah. Well, that's different than them and
I agree.
expecting them
That's
to.
why I said,
to
I
agree.
went with your first definition, which is
Right,
that
okay.
common human decency would,
Gotcha.
yes.
But,
Just to be clear,
Yes, sir.
that you say pressuring them, but you're not doing that directly. You're just asking the Russians to pressure them.
Correct. We fully expect Russia to use its influence on the regime to get it to grant access
But you
to.
don't have any direct leverage of your own. It's just your association with Russia through the ISSG.
Well, that's,
that
yeah,
gives
I
you
mean,
some-
that's the structure of the ISSG. That's how it works,
Mark,
for better or for worse.
Something that you have
Yes,
left
sir.
over, which is the refugees. I mean, we're coming into the end of the fiscal year, in
Yep.
October, and you've already allowed no more than 2,500, to the best of what I gather. You know, so you have about 10,000 that were promised to be allowed in by the end of the fiscal year. So where are you with that?
So we do remain committed to the president's plan to resettle some 85,000 of the world's most vulnerable, these refugees from around the world. And that includes, as you know, 10,000 from Syria. I think increases in processing capacity have improved our ability to meet the 10,000 target for Syrian refugee admissions. I think as of May 25th, we're at the 2,500 mark, so we're not there. We're a good ways from it, but we do expect the arrivals to increase exponentially as we move through the summer. So we are still saying we're going to meet that 10,000 person commitment. Yep.
Going to Iraq.
Yeah, sure.
Since we're still talking about trying to fight ISIL,
Yep.
among other things. Last week you talked about Fallujah. There are more reports about Shia militiamen detaining Sunni men trying to flee Fallujah. And there are more allegations that they're being abused, that they're being tortured. Dozens is one rough estimate. Even the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is saying, for Human Rights, is expressing concern about the situation. And he is also expressing concern that the Abadi government isn't doing enough to restrain the Shia militia from carrying out sectarian attacks. One, what is the U.S.'s assessment of the situation right now? What is the U.S. government saying to Prime Minister Abadi? What is the U.S. prepared to do in order to basically keep the Shia militia away from Fallujah so that people who are trying to escape the fighting can do so safely?
Sure. Lots of very good questions. And obviously, it's a very difficult situation in and around Fallujah. The reports, and we've seen these reports as well, are obviously concerning. We do believe, though, that Prime Minister Abadi has made an effort to investigate abuses of Iraqi civilians at the hands of Iraqi security forces. I think he's even pledged to form a committee, or has created a human rights committee to look at some of these abuses. We believe the government of Iraq has made an effort to avoid civilian casualties and to hold accountable those in isolated cases of misconduct. Now, there have been, and I talked about this last Friday, there have been efforts to screen citizens as they flee Fallujah. And I think I'm looking at my thing. I think some 15,000 civilians have already fled the fighting in and around Fallujah and have arrived and are safely being held at camps. And there have been screening measures put in place, and we've talked about that.
Right.
And partly that's common sense that Daesh or ISIL isn't trying to exfiltrate or get out of Fallujah, use it as an escape route. But let's be very clear that any kind of screening, while justified, needs to be done in a manner that is respectful of human rights and common dignity, and also done in a transparent manner.
There's already been
Yep.
a lot of talk, though,
Please.
about the fact that in the effort to liberate these communities
Yep.
from ISIL, that the U.S. would not want to see Shia militia going in because of
Right.
the very fundamental symbolism that represents. Is it appropriate for the Iraqi government to rely on these militia, the PMF, to do the screening? Should the Iraqi military be using some of its own forces to do the screening? And should the Shia militia even be allowed anywhere near Fallujah? Why can't they be held to barracks, to use an expression?
Well, I would refer you to the Iraqi government to talk about the composition of forces in and around Fallujah and how they're being utilized. I think that given the scale and scope of this operation, that they frankly need all the capable fighters that they have. But, you know, of course, we're concerned about the sectarian tensions inherent to the dynamic that you just raised. And again, we have raised our concerns with the Iraqi government, and they have also expressed a clear understanding of that dynamic as well, and an effort to avoid it. You know, the need. So if Shia militia are there, they are under the command and control of the Iraqi military. And
But then we hear
They-
about people being dragged away, bodies being turned up, some people so badly injured that they're now in hospital, you know, trying to get medical treatment that may not be easily attainable given that these are conditions of war. Here's an alternative suggestion. Perhaps the U.S. doesn't want to have its own people screening people leaving Fallujah, but there are other members of the coalition. Is it possible to ask the Arab countries that are part of the coalition to do the screening of people as they're trying to leave Fallujah?
well, again, those are all good points and good questions better directed to the Iraqi government. I would say that thus far in Fallujah, fully recognizing that we have seen reports and we've raised those reports and our concerns about them with the Iraqi government. But we have seen thus far an effort by Prime Minister Abadi and his leadership to manage the offensive carefully, deliberately, with respect to ordering safe passageways. And I talked about the 17,000 Fallujah residents who have gotten safe passage out of the city. And made an effort to respect both property and the well-being of the civilians. But again, as there are cases or allegations of these abuses, and you cited some of them, the Iraqi government has pledged to create a committee to look at these allegations and cases, or rather incidents, and follow up on them. And I think that that is absolutely commendable and necessary. Please.
Do you have confidence in this committee that are standing up?
I think, again, we'll wait and see, you know, but they have pledged to do so. Thus far, what we've seen largely from the Iraqi government has given us confidence that they are aware of these tensions on the battlefield and are taking steps to mitigate them. Please.
Did you confirm the reports by the UN Human Rights Commissioner today that he said he have credible reports about these violations? Are you confirming his position?
I have not seen those. I do know that we've seen reports of
But not
violations
the-
and
but
are
not the
concerned
commission.
about them. I'm not speaking to his. I have no idea what he said. I'm sorry. I haven't seen his comments.
He said he have credible reports about very sad violations against civilians fleeing from Fallujah.
I mean, again, we're aware of some of these reports, and we're concerned about them as well. Yeah. Please.
On China,
Are we done with Iraq? Yeah. Great.
there's been another unsafe intercept of fighter jets over the East China Sea. Do you have any comment on that, especially given that Secretary Kerry is in Beijing? Do you know if he has communicated the issue with his Chinese counterparts?
I mean, honestly, I would refer you to, he did a press avail earlier today with his Chinese counterpart, obviously talking more broadly about the SNED. He gave he and Treasury Secretary Jack Lew gave a press avail with their Chinese counterparts, State Councilor Yang Ziechu and Vice Premier Wang Yang. As I said, talked more broadly about all the issues in the relationship, but also spoke about our ongoing concerns about the South China Sea.
Do you think that, I mean, this incident sort of undermines any of the discussions coming so soon right after their discussions?
Look, I mean, again, I think they had a very candid discussion about that issue. That's part of why we have these meetings, so we can sit down and talk frankly and honestly and candidly with China about our concerns about their behavior regarding the South China Sea. We want to, look, our message hasn't changed. We continue to encourage all South China Sea claimants to avoid taking unilateral actions to change the status quo and to clarify their maritime claims in accordance with international law as reflected in the law of the Sea Convention. That message hasn't changed. It's been consistent. We continue to make that point to China and continue to look for ways that we can reinforce those peaceful mechanisms by which all claimants can have their voices heard.
Do you have any indication that this was intentional?
No indications, no. Yeah. Yeah, I'll get around to you.
Today,
Well, I'll get first you and then. Yeah.
thank you
Thanks.
very
No worries.
much. Today, Secretary Kerry has mentioned that the United States and China will not accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. It does mean that the United States think that China can pursue North Korea for nuclear states, or they not accept North Korea?
Well, I think, again, this was obviously one of the topics of conversation over the past couple of days, is concern over North Korea's continued provocative behavior in the region and the impact that has on the security of the Korean Peninsula and, frankly, the entire region. And that's obviously an issue that we discuss frequently with China. China is concerned about North Korea's behavior. And we are looking at how we can apply adequate pressure on the regime in North Korea to convince it to respond to the international community's concerns.
But the United States trust the Chinese, what are they saying, or?
Do we trust the Chinese
Yes,
to maintain pressure on them?
yes, sir.
It's been an ongoing conversation that we've had with China, as you know. And I think it's something that, China has concerns, but they also have influence. And so we value China's influence on North Korea, and they can play a very pivotal role. So we're always talking with them about ways to enhance that role. Now let's finish up with, yeah.
Just on what my colleague was saying. So can you confirm that it came up in the conversations that the Secretary had with his Chinese counterparts?
North Korea?
No, the intercept over the East China Sea?
I cannot confirm that actually, I mean, I know the South China Sea, but I don't know that this intercept came up. Frankly, I hadn't heard of it until I was just out here, so. Please.
So Judicial Watch yesterday released another transcript of Ambassador Mole's deposition, I guess on Friday.
Yep.
And throughout, at least according to the transcript of the deposition, he, repeatedly said there was a lot he couldn't remember when he learned of Secretary Clinton's email setup. Also, why he couldn't remember emailing her suggesting she set up his State Department account. Obviously, he's held several senior positions here at the department, is now in charge of implementing the Iran deal. Just wanted to get your explanation. I mean, how can that be that there's just so much that he doesn't remember from his times?
I'm not going to parse his testimony, or his deposition, rather. He spoke to his recollection of what happened and his knowledge of her use of email. And, Ambassador Mole is a well-respected and very experienced Foreign Service officer. I'll let his words stand for themselves. I think that you know, and we talked about this with the Inspector General's report a couple of, I guess, last week. You know, there was an incomplete understanding or knowledge of the extent of her use of personal email at the time she was in office. And we have acknowledged that. We've acknowledged that as a result of that, we are now trying to improve how we in-process secretaries of state and senior officials at the State Department. So we don't have that kind of miscommunication or misunderstanding in the future. But again, having some knowledge of personal use of email is far from having a complete knowledge of the extent of it.
But you don't think it's odd that, you know, he was, I believe, her executive secretary, that there's so much about her email, the server, the setup that he doesn't recall?
Well, again, I think that I don't think it's odd necessarily given how the system was constructed at the time. We've talked about this in the past. We've talked about the fact that really no one among the senior staff had a full and comprehensive knowledge of how much she was using her personal email. And if they had, they probably would have done it differently. She's also acknowledged that as well. So I'll leave it there.
Can I go to the House Management issue?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
We're done. I have a couple of questions.
Yep.
The Secretary General of the Arab League claimed that Secretary Kerry thwarted a strong French initiative last Friday, and in fact suggesting that he was responsible for that lackluster statement that came out of the meeting. Do you have any comment on that?
Look, Secretary Kerry went to Paris out of a desire to sit down with the other participants to really help shape a constructive conversation or a discussion about Middle East peace process.
Right.
And as I said, shape it in a constructive way. I'm not going to get into the internal deliberations about the final communique, but it's a joint communique. It reflects the views of all the participants and not just the United States.
But you know, Nabil Arabi has always made very positive and enthusiastic statements about Secretary Kerry and his efforts and so on. This is, this is the first time I saw a statement where it's the opposite. So,
Well,
are you saying that he's wrong? Is he wrong in suggesting that?
I mean, again, I'm not going to.
You're your boss. I mean, you can say no. You didn't. Yeah.
I'm going to say exactly what I just said, which is it was a joint communique. Secretary went there, and he spoke about this before he went there, that he is willing to sit down with like-minded governments and leaders around the world to talk about this issue. But ultimately, it's going to take the two parties to sit down at the same table to negotiate these tough issues. And as much as he can help set the parameters and set the conditions for that, he's going to work hard at doing so.
But you know, even statements made by U.S. officials, you know, whether it's the advisor to the president on national security or others, or even the secretary himself, saying that, you know, chances for face-to-face negotiations under the present conditions, indeed the current Israeli government, are probably a far-fetched kind of idea. So in the absence of that, why not put the weight of the United States behind some sort of an international effort? I mean, you know, I listened to Dr. Rice's speech yesterday, and on the one hand she's saying this, but on the other she's saying we will stand against any kind of any international effort, basically.
No, that's not true.
Well, that's basically what she said. She said we stand, you know, in UN forums and so on, where, you know, Israel is not perceived in a friendly way.
Well, that is true. I mean, and we've been clear about that in the past, and some of the statements and other efforts that have, we believe, have been politically slanted. But again, I don't think, look, I don't think there's nothing wrong with having efforts like the French put on last week, trying to bring people together to talk through some of these issues, to try to set the conditions. But again, let's be very clear, it is incumbent on the two parties to decide that they are at a place where they can sit down and talk through some of these issues. And once we get to that point, and we're all for working to create conditions that lead to that effort or that point in time, then we're going to, but until you get to that point, you're not going to make real progress.
Let me have a couple more questions.
Yes, sir, quickly.
The UN adopted a resolution to support Palestinian women last Friday, and it was overwhelmingly voted for, and except for the United States and Australia. And my question to you, why would you oppose a UN resolution that is intended to sort of empower Palestinian women?
Well, I think we put out an explanation of vote on this, Saeed. I mean, obviously, we remain committed to supporting the Palestinian people, along with many of our international partners, and that certainly includes Palestinian women in practical and effective ways. But, in our view, and it speaks to your last comment, in our view, we felt this resolution was one-sided. Any guys think?
No, wait, I got two. They're
Please.
brief, don't
Yep.
worry.
Okay.
One, semi-related to this. Do you, this building, or do you know more broadly the executive branch of the federal government in general, have any comments on these regulations that Governor Cuomo of New York put into effect yesterday on the anti-BDS or on the BDS situation?
Matt, I'll take the question. I'm not aware of that.
I don't know if you would or
Yep.
not. I'm just
No,
curious
we'll
if
look
you
at it
do
and-
what
yep,
it is.
we'll look at it.
And then secondly, have you seen this announcement out of Iran that the Iranian Foreign Ministry has rejected visa applications from 3 Republican congressmen, all of them critics of the Iran deal, who wanted to go to Iran to check out the implementation? And is this the kind of, regardless of what their motive was
Sure.
or is in terms of going, is this something that in your contacts with the Iranians you might object to?
I found out about this just before coming out. I know we're aware of the Iranian response to visa applications by some members of Congress, and the response came to us, I understand, and then we then passed it on to these members of Congress. I don't really have any specific comment on it.
No, I mean, would you like to see members of Congress travel to Iran to take a look around?
Look, I mean, it's, if they would so desire to travel there, we don't want to impede them, the
Well,
ability
no,
to
no,
do
it's
so.
not
We don't
gonna
have any diplomatic presence to provide support for any kind of
No, I
congressional
understand, but this is
delegation.
not like a private, these aren't private
Yeah,
citizens.
so, I mean,
They
we
are
wouldn't-
members of one branch of the
And-
government.
and
Would you
we certainly
be
wouldn't
willing
want
to?
We certainly wouldn't want to impede their ability to
Right,
travel.
but would you be willing to, go through the Swiss or whoever to see if they would reconsider?
I don't know. We'll see what they come back to us with. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep.